6 months of dead ends had brought me to this moment. Standing outside Santa Maria della Vittoria on a Tuesday night in October, while rain turned the cobblestones of North End into mirrors reflecting neon signs from nearby restaurants. The church loomed above me, all dark stone and Gothic arches, windows black and empty at 11 p.m. when any sensible person would be home. But 3 women had walked through those doors and never walked out again, and I was done being sensible. Rachel had approved the story 3 weeks ago, though not without reservations. "Just be careful, Megan," she'd said across her cluttered desk at the magazine, pushing her reading glasses up into her graying hair. "Missing persons cases have a way of getting messy, and if there's really something wrong with that church, you're walking into dangerous territory." I'd promised to stay in touch, to check in regularly, to not do anything stupid. 2 out of 3 wasn't bad. I pulled my jacket tighter against the wind that cut down Hanover Street, carrying with it the smell of garlic and basil from the restaurant still serving late dinners to tourists who didn't know better than to brave October weather. My camera bag hung heavy on my shoulder, packed with equipment I probably wouldn't use but brought anyway out of habit from years of field work. The last woman to disappear, Lauren Scott, had been seen entering the confessional booth on the left side of the nave. Security footage from a bodega across the street had captured her going in at 9:47 p.m. on a Friday. She never came out, at least not through the front door. The police had investigated, of course. They'd found nothing. The church had no other exits except a locked sacristy door that opened onto an alley, and the priest, Father Antonio, was 76 years old with arthritis and a solid alibi for that night. The case had gone cold within weeks, filed away with the other 2 disappearances that shared the same pattern. Young women, all in their late 20s, all last seen near or entering this church. No bodies, no witnesses, no answers. I tested the heavy wooden door and found it unlocked, which shouldn't have surprised me but did. Churches in this neighborhood usually locked up by 9, but maybe Father Antonio was inside, or maybe someone had forgotten. Either way, it was an invitation I couldn't refuse, even if every instinct I'd honed covering war zones and criminal investigations told me to turn around and come back during daylight hours with backup. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through what I immediately recognized as an empty space. No lights burned inside, except for a few votive candles near the altar, their flames casting dancing shadows across walls lined with paintings of saints and martyrs. The smell hit me next. That distinctive combination of incense, old wood, and candle wax that every Catholic church seems to share regardless of location. My footsteps on the marble floor sounded impossibly loud in the silence. I moved carefully down the center aisle, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The confessional booth stood along the left wall, just as the security footage had shown. 3 wooden structures that looked like miniature houses, each with doors on either side, and carved screens separating the priest's chamber from where the penitent would kneel. The one Lauren had entered was the middle booth, and I headed straight for it, fishing my phone from my pocket to use as a flashlight. The penitent's door opened with a soft groan of hinges that needed oil. Inside, it was cramped and dark. Barely enough room to kneel on the worn cushion that smelled of dust and old prayers. I ran my fingers along the wooden walls, looking for anything unusual, any sign of a hidden mechanism or passage that might explain how 3 women could vanish from a locked room. Nothing. Just solid wood and the carved screen separating me from the priest's side. That's when I heard it. A breath, not mine, coming from the other side of the screen. I froze, phone light still pointed at the wall, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. Someone was in the priest's chamber. At 11 at night. In a supposedly empty church. "Have you come to confess?" The voice was male, deep, with an accent I couldn't immediately place. Not the elderly Father Antonio, that was certain. This voice belonged to someone younger, someone who sounded alert and tense rather than sleepy or surprised. Every logical thought in my head screamed at me to leave, to get out of the booth and the church and not stop until I was back in my apartment with the door locked. But the journalist in me, the part that had gotten me into trouble more times than I could count, made me stay. If someone was using these confessionals for something illegal, pretending to hear confessions as cover, I needed to know. I needed to understand what happened to Lauren. to Samantha Wells, to Brittany Mitchell. So I knelt on the cushion, placed my phone in my pocket to hide the light, and played along. "Yes, Father," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I've come to confess. Tell me your sins." The words were right, the ritual phrase any priest would use, but something about the delivery was wrong. Too sharp, too focused, like he was listening for something specific rather than preparing to offer absolution. I improvised, drawing on half-remembered catechism classes from childhood. I've lied to people to get information for my work. I've deceived others to uncover truths they wanted to keep hidden. I've put myself in dangerous situations without thinking about the consequences. All true, technically, though I'd never felt the need to confess any of it before. Silence from the other side of the screen. I could barely make out a shape through the carved wood. A darker shadow against the darkness. Then, what kind of work requires such deception? No priest would ask that. The confessional was meant to be about the sin, not the details of one's daily life. I felt my stomach tighten with the realization that I'd made a mistake coming here, that whoever was on the other side of that screen wasn't who he was pretending to be. "I'm an investigative journalist," I said, deciding that honesty might be safer than continuing the charade. "I look into things people don't want looked into." "And what are you investigating here?" His voice had dropped lower, more dangerous. "In this church, at this hour?" Before I could answer, before I could decide whether to run or keep talking, I heard the sound of the main church doors opening. Not the careful creak I'd made, but a violent slam of wood against stone. Voices followed, speaking rapid Mandarin. At least 4 different speakers from what I could tell. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast through the nave. "Don't move!" The whisper came sharp and commanding from the other side of the screen. "Lower your head. Don't make a sound. If they find you, we're both dead." I pressed myself against the back wall of the confessional, making myself as small as possible, head down like he'd ordered. Through the gaps in the door, I could see lights now, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness of the church. The voices grew louder, aggressive, punctuated by sounds I'd heard before in war zones. The distinctive click of firearms being readied, the metallic scrape of weapons being drawn. They were searching for something. For someone. And I was trapped in a wooden box with no exit and no weapon, listening to what sounded like an armed hit squad methodically checking every corner of the church. Something heavy crashed, probably one of the pews being overturned. Glass shattered, maybe one of the stained glass windows or a statue. The footsteps came closer, and I held my breath, pressing my hand over my mouth to muffle any sound. Through the screen I could see the shadow on the other side shift slightly, and I realized the man in the priest's chamber was preparing for something, his posture changing from passive to predatory. One of the searchers stopped right outside the confessional. I could see his boots through the gap under the door. Expensive leather. City shoes not meant for the kind of work he was clearly doing. He said something in Mandarin, and another voice answered from across the nave. The boots moved away. 10 minutes. That's how long it took for them to search the entire church. Though it felt like hours. 10 minutes of absolute stillness while my legs cramped from kneeling and my lungs burned from breathing as shallowly as possible. 10 minutes of wondering who these men were, and why they were here, and how I'd managed to walk into the middle of something that had nothing to do with missing women, and everything to do with violence. I didn't understand. Finally, the voices retreated. The footsteps moved back toward the entrance. The doors opened and closed, this time more carefully, and then silence settled over the church again like a physical weight. I waited, not daring to move until I heard the soft click of the priest's chamber door opening. Then the penitent's door swung inward, and I found myself staring up at a man who was absolutely, definitely not a priest. He was young, maybe early 30s, wearing a black cassock that fit wrong on his broad shoulders and muscular frame. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his eyes caught what little light remained from the votive candles. Dark brown, almost black, and completely devoid of mercy or kindness. This was a man who had done violence, and would do it again without hesitation. The kind of eyes I'd seen on soldiers and mercenaries, and people who lived on the edge of civilization's rules. He looked me over quickly, assessing me the way a predator assesses potential prey, then made a decision. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice still low but no longer whispering. Right now. No questions. If you want to live through the night, you'll follow me and stay silent. I should have refused, should have demanded explanations, should have tried to run for the door, should have done literally anything other than what I did. But something about the absolute certainty in his voice, combined with the memory of those armed men searching the church, made me believe him. Whatever was happening here was bigger and more dangerous than I'd imagined, and this stranger in priest's clothing might be the only thing standing between me and whatever fate had befallen Lauren and the others. So I nodded once and stood on shaking legs, watching as he moved to the sacristy door with the practiced silence of someone trained in stealth. He produced a key from somewhere in the cassock, unlocked the door, and gestured for me to follow him into the darkness beyond. The sacristy was smaller than I expected, cluttered with vestments hanging from hooks on the walls and the faint smell of old incense clinging to everything. The man in the cassock moved through it like he'd memorized every inch, not bothering to turn on lights as he headed for what looked like a supply closet in the back corner. He pulled the door open to reveal shelves stacked with candles and prayer books, then reached past them to press something I couldn't see. A section of the back wall swung inward with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. "Inside," he ordered, glancing back at me with those dark eyes that held no patience for questions or hesitation. I hesitated anyway, because following strange men into secret passages was exactly the kind of decision that got people killed. Who were those men? Why were they looking for you? And what does any of this have to do with the missing women? He turned fully toward me then, and I saw his jaw tighten with barely controlled frustration. "You have two choices right now. You can come with me and maybe live long enough to get answers, or you can stay here and wait for them to come back. Because they will come back, and when they realize I'm gone, they're going to start looking for witnesses. Anyone who might have seen which direction I went." He paused, letting that sink in. "You were in that confessional. You heard things. That makes you a liability they'll eliminate without thinking twice." The logic was sound, even if I hated it. I'd heard them searching, heard the violence in their voices. Whatever was happening here went far beyond a story about missing women from a church. I'd stumbled into something bigger and more dangerous, and my options had narrowed to a single path forward. "Fine," I said, moving toward the hidden passage. "But I want answers once we're somewhere safe. You'll get them." He gestured for me to go first, and I realized it was a tactical decision. If I tried to run or do something stupid, he'd be right behind me to stop it. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, carved from stone that felt ancient under my fingertips as I steadied myself in the darkness. The door closed behind us with a solid thunk, and suddenly, the only light came from a small flashlight he produced from somewhere in the cassock. "Move forward, steps down in about 20 feet. I did as instructed, feeling my way along the rough walls, breathing air that tasted stale and unused. The steps, when I reached them, were uneven and worn smooth by centuries of feet. How many people had used this passage? And for what purposes? The historical part of my brain wanted to stop and document everything. Take photos. Ask questions about the construction and age of these tunnels. The survival-focused part kept me moving downward into the cool dampness that smelled of earth and old stone. We descended for what felt like several minutes before the passage leveled out into a wider tunnel, tall enough to stand upright in, with brick archways every 15 feet or so supporting the ceiling. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, echoing in the enclosed space. The man behind me kept the flashlight pointed forward, illuminating just enough of the path ahead to walk without tripping. "The church was built in 1887, he said suddenly, his voice echoing slightly off the walls. "But these tunnels are older. Colonial era, maybe earlier. Smugglers used them to move goods from the wharves to buildings throughout the North End without paying taxes or tariffs. Some say pirates used them too, though that's probably more legend than truth." "How do you know about them?" I asked, grateful for the conversation, if only because it distracted from the claustrophobic press of stone around us, and the very real possibility that I'd made a terrible mistake. "My family has been in this neighborhood for 3 generations. You learn the history, the hidden spaces, the routes that don't appear on any official map. It's necessary for survival in certain lines of work." That phrase, "certain lines of work," hung heavy with implication. I wanted to press him on it, to demand specifics about who he was and what he did, but something told me to wait. We were still in the tunnels, still potentially being pursued, and antagonizing the only person who knew the way out seemed like poor strategy. The passage branched several times, but he never hesitated, turning left or right with the confidence of someone who'd walked this route before. We passed what looked like old storage rooms carved into the walls, empty now except for rotting wooden crates, and the bones of small animals that had gotten lost down here and never found their way out. The thought made me shiver despite the physical exertion keeping me warm. "The women who disappeared," I said, as we rounded another corner, needing to bring the conversation back to what mattered. "Lauren Scott, Samantha Wells, Brittany Mitchell. Do you know what happened to them? Where they are?" He was quiet for several steps, and I thought maybe he wouldn't answer. "Then, they're alive. At least, they were as of 3 days ago. The Green Dragon Triad has them." The name meant nothing to me, though the triad part suggested organized crime with Asian connections. What's a triad doing kidnapping women from a Boston church? Not just any women, specific women with specific skills. All 3 speak fluent Mandarin. All 3 work in financial technology or cybersecurity. They weren't random targets. They were recruited, though recruited is probably too gentle a word for it. Coerced would be more accurate. My mind raced, connecting pieces I hadn't seen as related before. For what? Money laundering? Among other things. The Triad has been expanding operations into Boston for the past year, trying to establish territory. They need infrastructure, including people who can move money electronically without triggering federal oversight. Your 3 missing women are probably sitting in front of computers right now, building systems they never wanted to build. The cassock rustled as he moved, and I heard fabric tearing. When I glanced back, he'd ripped the bottom hem away and was using the strip of cloth to wipe something dark off his hands. Blood, I realized with a jolt. Old blood that had dried into the fabric. "Whose blood is that?" I asked, then immediately regretted it when he fixed me with a look that suggested I really didn't want the answer. "Someone who tried to stop me from getting to the church tonight." He failed. The casual way he said it sent ice through my veins. This man had killed someone, probably recently, and showed no remorse or hesitation in admitting it. Yet he'd also just told me information about the missing women that no one else had been able to uncover. He was dangerous, absolutely, but he was also my best and possibly only lead. "If you know where they are, why haven't you gotten them out? Because walking into a triad operation with guns blazing is how you get everyone killed, including the hostages. I've been tracking their movements, mapping their security, looking for weaknesses. It takes time, and time is something those women might not have much of." The tunnel began to slope upward, and the air grew fresher, less stale. We were approaching another exit. "So why were you in the church? Why were they looking for you there?" One of the corrupt priests who's been helping the Triad got nervous. Started talking to people he shouldn't have talked to, including me through an intermediary. "We were supposed to meet tonight at the church. I got there early and realized it was a trap, so I hid in the confessional. Unfortunately, you decided tonight was the perfect time to play investigative journalist in a locked church." His tone carried accusation, but I wasn't about to apologize for doing my job. "I've been looking for those women for 6 months. No one else seems to care that they disappeared. The police closed the cases. Their families have given up hope. Someone had to keep searching." "Noble," he said, though the word carried no warmth. "Also incredibly stupid. You could have been the 4th disappearance, and no one would have known what happened to you either." We reached a door, metal and modern unlike the ancient stone surrounding it. He pulled a key from inside the cassock and unlocked it, pushing it open to reveal a space that looked like an abandoned warehouse. Concrete floors, high ceilings with broken skylights letting in moonlight, the smell of oil and rust. In the center of the space sat a black SUV with windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. 2 men emerged from the vehicle as we approached. Both wore dark suits and had the same alert, dangerous quality as the man I'd been following. One was older, maybe in his 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair. The other was younger, built like he spent significant time in a gym. Both carried themselves like soldiers or bodyguards, weight balanced, hands ready to reach for weapons if needed. "Christopher," the older man said, his voice carrying relief mixed with reproval. "We've been waiting 30 minutes. The scanner picked up police bands reporting an alarm at Santa Maria della Vittoria. We thought they'd gotten you. Christopher." Finally, a name. He shrugged off the cassock, revealing the suit underneath. It had been expensive once, perfectly tailored to his frame. But now it was ruined. Dark stains spread across the white shirt, and the jacket had tears along one sleeve. He tossed the cassock aside and unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling up the sleeves with practiced efficiency. They tried. I had help. He gestured toward me, and both men turned their full attention in my direction. Being assessed by 3 dangerous men simultaneously was not an experience I'd recommend. "Who is she?" the older man asked, suspicion clear in his tone. "A complication," Christopher said, which I found mildly offensive given that I'd been minding my own business before he'd dragged me into secret tunnels. "She was in the church investigating the disappearances. The triad saw her with me, which means she's a target now whether we like it or not." "Christopher Versiani," I said, testing the name and watching his reaction. He barely moved, but something tightened around his eyes. "I'm guessing that's you? And I'm guessing you're not just some concerned citizen tracking down missing women out of the goodness of your heart." He studied me for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "No, I'm not. I'm the head of the Versiani family. We control certain operations in the North End and the Port District. The triad has been muscling in on our territory for months, and kidnapping those women was a message. They're showing that they can operate right under our noses, that our neighborhood isn't as secure as we thought. Mafia. He was Mafia. The realization should have terrified me more than it did, but I'd covered enough organized crime stories to know that not all criminals were created equal. Some operated with codes, with rules about civilians and unnecessary violence. Others had no limits at all. The triad sounded like the latter, which maybe made Christopher and his family the lesser evil in this particular equation. "And now I'm caught in the middle of a territorial dispute," I said, hating how my voice shook slightly despite my best efforts to sound calm. "Yes, which means you have 2 options. You can come with us, accept our protection while we figure out how to deal with the triad situation, or you can try to go back to your normal life and hope they don't track you down and eliminate you as a witness." He paused. "I wouldn't recommend the second option." The older man cleared his throat. "Christopher, we should move. If they tracked you to the church, they might track the tunnel exit." Christopher nodded, then returned his attention to me. "Decision time. I need an answer right now." I thought about Lauren Scott, wherever she was, probably terrified and forced to use her skills for criminals. I thought about my apartment in Boston, my work, my editor Rachel, who would be expecting an update soon. I thought about the men searching the church with weapons and cold voices. And I thought about the fact that Christopher had just handed me the biggest story of my career, wrapped in danger and moral ambiguity, and walking away meant never knowing how it ended. 72 hours, I said. "I'll accept protection for 72 hours while we compare information. I know things about the victims, their backgrounds, their habits before they disappeared. You know about the triad and their operations. Between us, we might actually be able to find them and get them out. But I need to contact my editor, let her know I'm okay." Christopher considered this, exchanged a glance with the older man who gave a slight nod, then agreed. "One message. Vague. Nothing about locations or names, and it goes through our secure channels first." "Fine. Get in the car. We're going to a safe location about 90 minutes from here. Once we're there, you can send your message, and we'll start talking about what you know and what I know." He opened the rear door, gesturing for me to enter. The interior was leather and luxury, climate-controlled and soundproofed. I slid across the seat, and Christopher followed, settling beside me while maintaining a careful distance. The older man took the driver's seat, and the younger one rode shotgun. Literally, given the weapon I could see holstered under his jacket. As the engine started and we pulled out of the warehouse, I realized I'd just voluntarily gotten into a car with 3 men I didn't know, heading to an unknown location, with no backup and no real plan. Every true crime documentary I'd ever watched screamed that this was how people ended up as statistics. But those women were still out there, still waiting for someone to find them. and now I had the resources and information to actually do it, even if those resources came with more danger than I'd bargained for. Christopher pulled out his phone, typed something, then handed it to me. "Your message. Keep it simple." I took the device and composed quickly, following a lead. "Maybe out of contact for a few days. Don't worry, I'm safe. We'll explain everything soon. M." He read it, nodded approval, and sent it through whatever encrypted system he used. Then he took the phone back and settled into the seat, closing his eyes briefly like he was exhausted. "Cape Cod?" I asked, remembering the 90 minutes he'd mentioned. "A property my family owns. Secure, private, away from the city where the triad has eyes everywhere." He opened his eyes again, turning to look at me directly. "For what it's worth, you made the right choice. Going home would have been a death sentence. At least this way, you have a chance." I wasn't sure if that was meant to be comforting or threatening, but I chose to take it as the former. We had 72 hours to figure out how to rescue 3 women from a criminal organization that had already proven willing to kill. It wasn't much time, but it was more than those women had yesterday. The car accelerated onto what I recognized as the highway heading south out of Boston, and I watched the city lights fade behind us, carrying me further from everything familiar and deeper into a world I'd only ever written about from the outside. Now I was inside it, for better or worse, and there was no turning back. The house materialized out of coastal fog, like something from a Gothic novel. All weathered stone and wide windows facing the Atlantic. We'd driven the last 20 minutes in complete darkness, winding through back roads that didn't appear on any GPS, until the SUV finally pulled into a circular driveway, illuminated by subtle landscape lighting. Christopher had remained silent for most of the journey, making occasional calls in what I assumed was Italian, his voice too low for me to catch more than fragments. Joseph cut the engine and turned in his seat. "Welcome to the Versiani summer residence. You'll be comfortable here, and more importantly, you'll be safe. The property has security that would make the Secret Service jealous." "Comforting," I muttered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it sarcastically or not. Christopher opened his door and gestured for me to follow. The salt air hit me immediately, thick with brine and the sound of waves crashing against rocks somewhere below the house. October on Cape Cod meant cold nights and colder mornings, and I wrapped my jacket tighter as we climbed the stone steps to the main entrance. The interior defied my expectations completely. Instead of dark, oppressive spaces filled with heavy furniture and the weight of criminal enterprise, I found myself in an open-plan living area with soaring ceilings, whitewashed walls, and modern art that looked original rather than mass-produced. Floor-to-ceiling windows along one entire wall offered views of the ocean, though the darkness outside turned them into mirrors reflecting the 3 of us standing in the foyer. A woman in her 60s appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face carried the kind of warmth that seemed genuine rather than performed. "Christopher, finally." I was beginning to worry. "Sorry for the delay, Teresa. We had complications." He nodded toward me. "This is Megan Foster. She'll be staying with us for a few days. She'll need a room prepared, and probably something to eat. We haven't stopped since leaving the city." Teresa's eyes swept over me with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to reading people quickly. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she smiled and gestured down a hallway. "The blue room is already made up. Ms. Foster, if you'll follow me, I'll show you where everything is." I glanced at Christopher, who nodded permission, then followed Teresa through a hallway lined with photographs. Most showed the same locations, the house in different seasons, the ocean in various moods. But what caught my attention were the family pictures. Christopher younger, laughing with people who shared his dark coloring and strong features. An older couple who must have been his parents. Groups at celebrations, weddings, christenings. All the normal markers of life that seemed at odds with what I knew about his occupation. "The family is very important to Christopher," Teresa said, noticing my attention. "Everything he does for them. Sometimes people forget that about him." The blue room was on the second floor, spacious and bright despite the late hour, with walls painted in soft shades of seafoam and cream. A king-sized bed dominated one wall, covered in linens that looked expensive and comfortable. French doors opened onto a small balcony with wrought iron railings. and through them I could hear the ocean more clearly now. A constant rhythm that would have been soothing under different circumstances. "Bathroom is through there." Teresa indicated a door to the left. "I'll bring up some clothes for you. You're about my daughter's size, and she keeps things here for when she visits. Nothing fancy, but clean and comfortable. Dinner will be ready in 30 minutes if you'd like to join them downstairs." "Thank you," I managed, suddenly overwhelmed by the normalcy of it all. I'd been kidnapped, or rescued, or possibly both, by a Mafia boss. And now I was being offered dinner in a comfortable bedroom like I was a guest at a bed and breakfast. Teresa paused at the door. "Christopher is a good man, Ms. Foster. I know what people say about him, what they assume. But I've worked for this family for 15 years, and I've never seen him hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. Those women you're looking for, he'll find them. Once he commits to something, he doesn't stop until it's done." She left before I could respond, closing the door with a soft click. I stood in the center of the room, trying to process the past few hours, trying to reconcile the violence I'd witnessed in the church with the careful consideration being shown to me now. Christopher Versiani was either the most sophisticated predator I'd ever encountered, or he was exactly what Teresa suggested, a man operating in a world of necessary evils with a code that separated him from true monsters. The bathroom was as impressive as the bedroom, all marble and chrome, with a shower that could have fit 4 people comfortably. I caught sight of myself in the mirror and winced. My hair was wild from the wind and tunnels, my face pale with exhaustion and adrenaline crash, my clothes rumpled and dirty. I looked exactly like someone who'd spent the evening running through underground passages fleeing armed criminals. A knock at the door interrupted my self-assessment. Teresa had returned with an armful of clothes, which she laid out on the bed with efficient movements. Jeans, sweaters in muted colors, underwear still in packages, thick socks, everything practical and well-made. "Take your time," she said. "The men will be in the library when you're ready. It's downstairs, first door on the left past the living area." I showered quickly, letting the hot water wash away some of the night's terror, then dressed in jeans and a gray sweater that fit well. My phone had 1 bar of signal, which surprised me given how remote we were, though I suspected Christopher's security system included signal boosters. Rachel had responded to my earlier message with a simple, "Be careful," which suggested she knew better than to ask too many questions over text. The house was quiet as I made my way downstairs, following the smell of cooking food. The library Teresa had mentioned was exactly where she'd indicated, a room lined floor to ceiling with books that looked read rather than decorative. A large wooden table dominated the center, covered with laptops, papers, and what appeared to be maps of Boston and the surrounding areas. Christopher sat at the head of the table, now wearing jeans and a dark Henley instead of the ruined suit. He'd showered too, his hair still damp, and without the cassock and blood-stained clothing he looked younger, less intimidating. Joseph sat to his right, typing on a laptop with reading glasses perched on his nose. Both looked up when I entered. "Feeling better?" Christopher asked, gesturing to an empty chair across from him. "Cleaner, at least. I'm not sure better is the right word for any of this." Joseph smiled slightly. "Fair assessment. Christopher, should I brief her, or do you want to?" "I'll do it." Christopher stood and moved to the maps, pointing to various marks and notations I couldn't decipher from my position. The Green Dragon Triad has been operating in Boston for about 18 months. They started small, testing boundaries, seeing how much they could expand without triggering a response from established families. About a year ago, they got bolder, started moving into territories that were clearly marked as ours, setting up operations in the Port District, recruiting people from our neighborhood. I moved closer to see the map better. He'd marked several locations with red pins, all clustered in and around the North End and waterfront areas. "When did they start taking the women?" 6 months ago. Lauren Scott was first, though we didn't realize it was connected to the triad until the second woman disappeared. Samantha Wells was taken 3 months later. Same pattern, same church. By the time Brittany Mitchell vanished 6 weeks ago, we knew it was deliberate targeting. Joseph spent weeks tracking their movements, following money trails, intercepting communications. Joseph looked up from his laptop. "They're sophisticated, I'll give them that. Using encrypted messaging, moving operations frequently, keeping tight security. But everyone makes mistakes eventually. We identified a pattern in their communications, traced it back to 3 possible locations. You said they were coercing the women to work on money laundering operations, I said, taking the seat Christopher had indicated. How does that work exactly? I mean, I understand the basic concept, but what specifically are they making them do? Christopher returned to his seat, leaning back with his hands steepled in front of him. Cryptocurrency is the easiest answer. Moving money through traditional banking leaves, trails that law enforcement can follow. But cryptocurrency offers anonymity if you know what you're doing. The triad needs people who can set up wallets, execute trades, move funds through multiple exchanges fast enough that tracking becomes nearly impossible. Lauren Scott worked for a fintech startup specializing in blockchain security. Samantha Wells was a software engineer who'd published papers on cryptocurrency vulnerabilities. Brittany Mitchell was an accountant with a specialty in international tax law. The pieces clicked into place. So they grabbed specialists who could build them an untraceable financial network. Exactly. And by using coercion rather than recruitment, they ensure loyalty through fear rather than payment. Cheaper and more reliable from their perspective. Joseph pulled up something on his laptop and turned it so I could see. Financial transaction records, pages of them, with highlighting and annotations. This is what we've tracked so far. Millions moving through accounts connected to shell corporations. Most of it ending up in accounts we've linked to triad leadership in Hong Kong and Shanghai. Your 3 missing women are likely managing different parts of the operation, keeping the money flowing while staying invisible to federal oversight. I studied the records, my journalist's brain automatically looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might provide additional leads. Have you considered going to the FBI with this? I mean, this is federal-level financial crime. They have resources you don't. Christopher's expression hardened slightly. The FBI would spend months building a case, getting warrants, following procedures. By the time they moved, those women would either be dead or shipped overseas where we'd never find them. And frankly, federal involvement would mean questions about how I obtained this information, which I can't answer without implicating myself and my organization in activities that, while not related to this case, wouldn't look good under scrutiny. So your hands are tied by your own criminal enterprise, I said, then immediately regretted the bluntness. But Christopher didn't look offended. Yes, that's the reality of operating outside the law. We can't ask for help from the very authorities we've spent decades avoiding, which is why we have to handle this ourselves, quietly and quickly. Teresa appeared at the door with a tray of food, pasta with what smelled like fresh marinara sauce, bread that looked homemade, a simple salad. She set it on a side table and served us with the efficiency of long practice, then disappeared again without a word. We ate in relative silence for a few minutes, and I realized I was starving. The pasta was perfect, the sauce rich with garlic and basil, the bread still warm from the oven. Teresa clearly took her cooking seriously. "Tell me about your investigation," Christopher said after a while. "What did you find that the police didn't?" I swallowed and set down my fork. The police treated each disappearance as unrelated. 3 women vanishing over 6 months, different neighborhoods, different occupations. The only connection was the church, and they didn't see that as significant. But I noticed patterns they missed. All 3 women spoke Mandarin fluently. All 3 had specialized financial or technical skills. All 3 had recently ended relationships or lived alone, which meant fewer people actively looking for them immediately after they vanished. Joseph looked interested. "How did you connect them to the church?" "Security footage from nearby businesses. The police checked the church's internal cameras, but there aren't any. So they assumed nothing useful could be found. I spent weeks going door to door, asking businesses if I could review their external security footage. A bodega across the street had a camera that captured part of the church entrance. I saw Lauren go in. Then I found 2 other businesses with cameras that showed different angles. Samantha and Brittany, both entering that same church within an hour of last being seen. Christopher studied me with what might have been respect. The police should have done that footwork. They should have. But missing persons cases get dropped when there are no bodies, no witnesses, no obvious suspects. These women just vanished, and without evidence of foul play, the cases went cold. Their families couldn't afford private investigators, and the media wasn't interested because none of them were wealthy or connected. They were just normal people who fell through the cracks, until you decided not to let them, Joseph said quietly. Someone had to care. Someone had to keep looking. I met Christopher's gaze directly, which is why I'm here, despite every rational instinct telling me to run. You have resources and information I don't. I have details about the victims that might help locate them. Between us, we might actually be able to do this. Christopher nodded slowly, then stood and moved to a different map, this one showing the greater Boston area in detail. Based on intercepted communications and surveillance, we've identified 3 probable locations where the triad might be holding them. An abandoned warehouse in the Port District, a house in suburban Quincy, and a cargo ship currently docked in Boston Harbor. Joseph has teams watching all 3, but we need confirmation before we move. Going after the wrong location tips them off and puts the women at greater risk. So what's the plan? I asked, joining him at the map. We narrow it down. You know these women's backgrounds, their habits, their skills. That might help us determine which location makes the most sense for their operation. The warehouse would be good for storage and security, isolated location with controlled access. The Quincy house would be better for long-term concealment. Normal suburban neighborhood where unusual activity wouldn't be immediately noticeable. The cargo ship offers mobility. They could move the operation out of the country if they felt threatened. I studied each location, thinking about what I knew. Lauren and Samantha both had backgrounds that required stable internet connections for their work. Cryptocurrency trading needs reliable, high-speed access. A warehouse might not have that infrastructure, and a cargo ship definitely wouldn't. The house makes the most sense if they're running active operations. Joseph made a note on his laptop. That matches what we've observed. More electronic activity around the Quincy location. Lots of delivered equipment that could be computer servers, generators for backup power. But the warehouse could be where they're storing physical records or backup systems, I continued, following the logic. And the ship could be their exit strategy if things go wrong. Christopher pointed to specific marks on the map. My thinking exactly. Which means we need eyes on all 3 locations simultaneously. Coordinated timing so that hitting one doesn't alert the others. That's a military-level operation, I said. How many people do you have who can pull that off? More than you'd think. The Versiani family isn't just me and Joseph. We have over 24 people we trust completely, most with military or law enforcement backgrounds who've chosen to work with us for various reasons. It's not the triad's numbers, but we have better training and knowledge of the territory. A sound cut through our discussion, sharp and insistent. Joseph's phone buzzed, then Christopher's, then a third device I hadn't noticed sitting on the table. All 3 men, Christopher, Joseph, and the driver who'd stayed with the SUV, reacted simultaneously. Security alert, Joseph said, already pulling up camera feeds on his laptop. Something triggered the perimeter sensors. Christopher moved behind him, watching the screens that showed various angles of the property in infrared. There, northeast corner, about 200 yards out. I saw it too. Small shapes moving between trees, at least 3 separate heat signatures. The triad? Reconnaissance drones, Joseph identified, zooming in on one of the shapes. Small commercial models, nothing military grade. They're checking the property, probably trying to confirm we're here. Christopher's expression went cold, calculating. Lockdown protocol. Shut the exterior lights, activate all cameras, get everyone inside and armed. They're not attacking tonight, just gathering information. But I want to be ready in case I'm wrong. Joseph was already moving, phone pressed to his ear, issuing rapid commands. Christopher turned to me, his voice calm despite the sudden tension. Go back to your room, lock the door, stay away from the windows. This is probably nothing more than them confirming I survived the church, but I'm not taking chances with your safety. What about you? I asked, hating how my voice wavered. This is my house, my territory. I'll be fine. He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, the touch grounding and oddly reassuring. Trust me, Megan. I've dealt with worse than surveillance drones. I wanted to argue, wanted to stay and see what would happen, but the look in his eyes told me this wasn't negotiable. So I headed back upstairs, my heart pounding, listening to the sounds of the house transforming around me. Lights cutting off, doors locking, the subtle mechanical whir of security systems activating. From my room, I watched through a crack in the curtains as Christopher and two other men I hadn't seen before moved across the darkened lawn with weapons drawn, hunting the drones that had dared to violate his sanctuary. They moved like shadows, coordinated and professional, and I found myself wondering again about the man who had pulled me into this world. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. All clear, get some sleep. Tomorrow we plan the rescue operation. I lay in bed, listening to the ocean, and thought about Lauren, Samantha, and Brittany, wherever they were, hoping they could hold on just a little bit longer, because now we weren't just investigating their disappearance. We were actively planning to bring them home. Consequences be damned. Morning came too early, gray light filtering through the curtains, and the sound of gulls crying over the water. I'd barely slept, my mind replaying the drone incident and what it meant. The triad knew we were here, or at least suspected. That changed everything about timing and safety. When I made my way downstairs, I found Christopher already in the library with Joseph and 3 other men I hadn't met yet. They were studying blueprints spread across the table, coffee cups scattered among the papers. Christopher glanced up when I entered, and I noticed the exhaustion around his eyes despite his alert posture. "We're moving the timeline up," he said without preamble. "The drone surveillance last night means we have maybe 48 hours before they either move the women or reinforce their security. We hit all 3 locations tomorrow night." Joseph pointed to the blueprints. "Megan, these are the layouts we've compiled for each site. The Quincy house is here, standard 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood. The warehouse is commercial district, mostly abandoned buildings around it. The cargo ship is docked at Pier 7, registered to a shell company, but we know it's Triad-owned. I studied the plans, my journalist's eye noting details. I want to be part of the team going to the Quincy house." The room went silent. Christopher set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Absolutely not. You're a civilian with no tactical training. You'd be a liability." "I have tactical training," I countered, meeting his gaze. "I spent 3 years covering conflicts in Syria and Afghanistan. I know how to move in hostile territory, how to stay quiet, how to follow orders in dangerous situations. And more importantly, I've studied photographs of those 3 women for months. I could identify them from a distance in bad lighting." "Can any of your people say the same?" "She has a point," Joseph said quietly. "Recognition could save crucial seconds if we need to confirm targets before extraction." Christopher's jaw tightened. "It's too dangerous. If something goes wrong, if the Triad has more people there than we expect, I'm not risking your life on a rescue operation. With respect, that's not your decision to make." I kept my voice level despite the frustration building in my chest. "Those women disappeared because no one cared enough to look hard. I've spent half a year trying to find them. I'm not sitting in this house while you go get them. Either I'm part of the team, or I find my own way there." The threat was empty, and we both knew it, but something in my determination must have registered, because Christopher exchanged a long look with Joseph before sighing heavily. "Fine, but you're with the Quincy team only, which will be the smallest operation. Visual identification from a distance. Nothing more. You follow every order exactly as given, and if I tell you to retreat, you retreat immediately." "Understood. Understood." Over the next 36 hours, I learned exactly how seriously Christopher took planning. Every morning started at 6 with briefings in the library, reviewing updated intelligence Joseph's surveillance teams had gathered overnight. Every afternoon involved running through scenarios, contingency plans, communication protocols. Christopher was meticulous to the point of obsession, questioning every assumption, stress testing every decision. But it was during the evenings, after the others had left, and it was just Christopher, Joseph, and me reviewing the day's progress, that I began to see past the careful control he maintained. Small things revealed themselves. The way he touched the grip of his weapon 3 times before holstering it, always 3, never 2 or 4. The way he avoided talking about his family despite the photographs everywhere. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. His expression unreadable, but intense. On the third night, while Joseph was on a call with one of his surveillance teams, Christopher and I ended up alone in the library. He was cleaning his weapon with practiced efficiency, and I was reviewing my notes on the victims. "Why do you do that?" I asked, watching him check the magazine for the third time. "Do what?" "Check everything 3 times. The magazine, the safety, the chamber. Always 3. His hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. "My cousin Anthony died because someone didn't properly check their weapon before an operation. Misfire killed him instantly. He was 23. Christopher looked up at me, his dark eyes holding memories I couldn't see. "So I check 3 times. Once for the weapon, once for the person it might save, once for the person it might kill. It's a reminder that every detail matters." The rawness in his voice caught me off guard. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrible. It taught me to be careful. In my world, carelessness gets people killed." He set the weapon aside and leaned back in his chair. "What about you? That necklace you wear, you touch it whenever you're worried or thinking hard. What's the story there?" My hand went instinctively to the silver pendant at my throat. A small compass rose, worn smooth with time. My mother gave it to me before I left for my first overseas assignment. She said as long as I wore it, I'd always find my way home. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. She died 2 years later in a car accident. I never got to tell her how many times thinking about that compass kept me from giving up in dangerous situations. "She'd be proud of you," Christopher said quietly. "What you're doing for these women, the risks you're taking, that takes courage most people don't have. Or stupidity. The line is pretty thin." "Maybe. But I've seen a lot of people in my life, Megan. Some brave, some stupid, some both. You're not stupid. Stubborn, definitely, but not stupid." The moment stretched between us, charged with something I wasn't ready to name. Joseph's return broke it, but the understanding remained. The day of the operation arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the kind of October evening that felt more like summer. Christopher gathered all 3 teams in the library for final briefing. 12 people total, divided into groups of 4 for each location. I would be with Joseph's team hitting the Quincy house. Christopher would lead the warehouse team. A man named Vincent, who'd been introduced as former Navy, would take the cargo ship. "Simultaneous entry at 9 p.m., Christopher instructed, pointing to the synchronized watches everyone wore. "Radio silence except for emergencies. Each team has 30 minutes to confirm targets, secure any intelligence, and extract. If you encounter resistance beyond what we've planned for, you retreat and call for backup. No heroics, no improvisation. We do this clean and professional." He looked directly at me for that last part, and I nodded understanding. The drive to Quincy took 40 minutes. Joseph at the wheel with me in the passenger seat, and 2 other men in the back. We parked 3 blocks from the Target house, in the lot of a closed grocery store, and moved on foot through backyards and between houses. The neighborhood was quiet, families inside eating dinner or watching television, unaware that armed men were moving through their peaceful suburb. The Target house sat on a corner lot, 2-story colonial painted pale yellow with white trim. Lights burned in the upstairs windows, and I could see the blue glow of computer screens through curtains that hadn't been fully closed. Joseph had been right about the electronic activity. We took position behind a hedge 2 houses down, and Joseph produced night vision binoculars. Through them, I could see shadows moving inside. At least 3 people on the 2nd floor, 2 on the 1st. But the distance and angles made identification impossible. "We need to get closer," I whispered. "I can't tell if any of those shapes are the women from here." Joseph considered this, then spoke into his radio in a voice too low for me to hear clearly. After a moment, he nodded to himself. "Team 2 is moving to the back entrance. When they signal, we approach the side window. You'll have maybe 2 minutes to make identification before we have to pull back or commit to entry." My heart hammered as we waited for the signal. This was it, the moment that would determine if we'd found them. The radio crackled once, twice. Joseph tapped my shoulder and we moved, staying low. crossing the neighbor's yard to the gap between houses that gave us a direct sightline into the target's ground floor. Through the window, I saw them. A room set up like a high-tech office. 6 computers on long tables. Whiteboards covered in code. And there, sitting at one of the computers with exhaustion clear in her posture, was Lauren Scott. I recognized her immediately from the photographs I'd memorized, though she looked thinner now. Her hair pulled back carelessly, dark circles under her eyes visible even from this distance. "That's Lauren," I breathed. "Front left computer. It's definitely her." Joseph relayed this over the radio, then signaled for us to move to another angle. We circled to the back where Team 2 had taken position. Through the kitchen window, I spotted someone else, a woman with red hair pulled into a ponytail. Her face turned slightly away, but when she reached for something on the counter, I saw her profile and recognition clicked into place. Samantha Wells. That's her in the kitchen. 2 confirmed, Joseph whispered into his radio. Preparing for entry. That's when everything went wrong. Joseph's radio crackled with Christopher's voice, strained and urgent. "All teams, abort. Warehouse is a trap. I repeat, warehouse is a trap. Multiple hostiles were pinned down. Need immediate extraction." My blood turned to ice. Christopher was in trouble, outnumbered and trapped in that warehouse across the city. Joseph was already moving, signaling his team to fall back. But my mind was racing ahead to terrible conclusions. If we left now, we might never get another chance at the Quincy house. But if we didn't help Christopher, he and his team could die. "Joseph." I grabbed his arm as we retreated to the car. "We need to help them. Christopher has backup protocols. Vincent's team is closest, they'll provide support." But I could hear the worry in his voice despite the professional calm. We were halfway back to the vehicle when another burst of radio traffic came through, this time Christopher's second in command at the warehouse. "Officer down. Multiple hostiles. Request immediate backup. We cannot hold this position." Joseph swore viciously in Italian and picked up his pace. When we reached the car, he was already pulling up a map on his phone, calculating routes and times. 20 minutes to the warehouse if traffic is light. Vincent's team is 12 minutes out. 12 minutes could be an eternity in a firefight. I made a decision that would either save lives or ruin everything. "I have a contact," I said quickly, pulling out my phone. "Detective Ryan Mitchell, Organized Crime Division. I covered a story 3 years ago on human trafficking. He was my source. If I call him, tell him there's an active situation involving kidnapped women and a firefight in progress, he can get units there faster than we can." Joseph stared at me. "You want to call the police? To a Mafia operation? I want to save Christopher's life. And if cops show up, the triad has to back down or face charges that actually stick. It's the only leverage that works against both sides. Christopher will never forgive you for involving law enforcement. Then he can hate me while he's alive instead of dead in a warehouse." Joseph hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, then nodded once. "Make the call. But you take full responsibility for the consequences." My hands shook as I dialed Mitchell's number, praying he still used the same phone after 3 years. It rang twice before his familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Mitchell. Detective, it's Megan Foster. I don't have time to explain everything, but I need units at the old shipping warehouse, Pier 12 in the Port District. There's a kidnapping situation, 3 women being held by a criminal organization. And there's an active firefight happening right now. People are going to die if you don't get there immediately." "Foster. How the hell do you know this?" "I've been investigating the disappearances of Lauren Scott, Samantha Wells, and Brittany Mitchell for 6 months. I found them. They're in Quincy, but there's a simultaneous operation at the warehouse that's gone bad. I'll explain everything later. But right now you need to trust me and send every available unit." Silence for a heartbeat. Then the sound of movement, keys jingling. "I'm 10 minutes out with 2 patrol units already in the area." "But Foster, if you're wrong about this, if this is some kind of setup, you'll be looking at obstruction charges." "I'm not wrong. Just hurry." I ended the call and looked at Joseph. "Done. Now drive." We broke every speed limit getting to the port, Joseph's phone on speaker as Vincent's team reported their arrival at the warehouse. Gunfire was clearly audible in the background of the transmission, sharp cracks echoing through the radio. Then, blessed and terrifying, the sound of sirens. Police inbound, Vincent reported. Multiple units, they're surrounding the building. Triad forces are pulling back. Joseph let out a breath I didn't realize he'd been holding. Christopher, status? Alive. Pissed off, but alive. Christopher's voice came through rough but strong. Someone called the cops. I'm guessing I know who. She saved your life, Joseph said simply. She also just complicated everything exponentially. But we'll deal with that later. Right now, we need to secure the women before the Triad realizes we're hitting Quincy too. By the time we reached the warehouse, it was chaos. Police cruisers blocked both ends of the street. Officers in tactical gear moving through the building. I spotted Christopher immediately, standing by an ambulance with paramedics checking the bleeding wound on his left arm, while he gestured with the other hand, clearly giving orders to his remaining team members. His eyes found mine across the distance, and even from 50 feet away, I could see the fury and something else. Maybe relief, maybe frustration. Definitely complicated emotions he'd have to sort through later. Detective Mitchell appeared at my window before I could get out of the car. Start talking, Foster, and this better be good. The next 20 minutes existed in a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and controlled chaos. Police units converged on the warehouse from 3 directions while Detective Mitchell kept me in his cruiser, alternating between asking questions and barking orders into his radio. Through the windshield, I watched federal agents in tactical gear move through the building, weapons drawn, as remaining Triad members were escorted out in handcuffs. Christopher emerged supported by 2 paramedics, his left arm wrapped in temporary bandaging, blood seeping through the white gauze. Even injured and surrounded by law enforcement, he moved with that same dangerous grace, his attention sweeping the scene until his eyes found mine. The fury in his gaze was palpable even across the distance, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. Relief, maybe. Or betrayal. Possibly both. That's him, Mitchell said, following my line of sight. Christopher Versiani. We've been trying to build a case against his organization for 5 years. Never enough evidence that sticks. Too many lawyers, too many people too scared to testify. He turned to look at me directly. You want to tell me how you ended up working with a known crime boss on a kidnapping case? I chose my words carefully. I've been investigating the disappearances of 3 women for 6 months. Lauren Scott, Samantha Wells, Brittany Mitchell. The police closed their cases. Their families had given up. I kept digging because someone had to care. My voice gained strength as I continued. Tonight, I received information that they were being held by the Green Dragon Triad, forced to work on financial crimes. When I realized there was a firefight with multiple casualties imminent, I called you, because saving lives matters more than anything else. And Versiani? What's his involvement? His organization operates in the same territory the Triad has been trying to infiltrate. The kidnappings were part of a larger territorial dispute. He was trying to locate the women for his own reasons. I used that situation to get information I couldn't access any other way. Mitchell studied me with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd heard too many carefully constructed half-truths. You realize that makes you an accessory to whatever criminal activity he was engaged in tonight. I realize I just helped you rescue 6 kidnapped women and handed you a major Triad operation. What happens to me is less important than what happens to them. Before Mitchell could respond, another detective approached with urgent news. The Triad members we detained are talking, trying to cut deals. They've given us the location of a cargo ship at Pier 7. Says there are more victims being held there, including the 3 women Foster mentioned. From their statements, we would later learn that during the chaos at the warehouse, another crew had swept through the Quincy house, stripping the place bare and moving the women onto the ship in preparation for a fast departure. My heart leaped. That's them. Lauren, Samantha, and Brittany. They have to be on that ship. Mitchell was already moving, issuing orders into his radio. All available units to Pier 7. Federal agents standing by for coordinated entry. No one moves until we have the location secured. I'm coming with you, I said, climbing out of the cruiser before he could object. Like hell you are. You're a civilian and a potential witness. You stay here. Those women have been missing for 6 months. I've studied their faces, their cases, every detail of their lives. I can identify them faster than anyone else you have. Every second counts if they're being held on a ship that could leave port. Mitchell considered this for approximately 2 seconds before nodding curtly. You stay behind me at all times. You follow every order exactly as given. You do anything stupid, I will personally arrest you for obstruction. Clear. Crystal. The convoy to Pier 7 moved with lights, but no sirens, trying to maintain some element of surprise. Through the window of Mitchell's cruiser, I watched the port district slide past. Industrial buildings and shipping containers stacked like giant building blocks. Christopher had been taken to a different location for medical treatment, Joseph accompanying him, which meant I had no way to know if he was okay beyond the paramedics' assurance that the gunshot wound was superficial. Pier 7 was lit by harsh industrial lighting, the cargo ship looming against the night sky like a steel mountain. Federal agents had already established a perimeter by the time we arrived, and I recognized one of them as the lead on human trafficking cases I'd interviewed years ago for a different story. The rescue operation was precise and professional. Agents moved through the ship methodically, clearing rooms, securing evidence, calling for medical personnel. I waited at the base of the gangway with Mitchell, every muscle tense, until finally an agent emerged, escorting 3 women wrapped in emergency blankets. I saw Lauren first. Thinner than in her photographs, hair unwashed and limp, dark circles under her eyes, but alive and walking under her own power. Behind her came Samantha, her red hair tucked into a ponytail, glasses slightly askew. And finally, Brittany, the youngest of the 3, barely holding back tears, as a female agent guided her down the gangway. That's them, I breathed, my own eyes burning. All 3. Lauren Scott, Samantha Wells, Brittany Mitchell. Mitchell signaled for paramedics while I approached slowly, not wanting to frighten them. Lauren looked up as I neared, confusion crossing her exhausted features. My name is Megan Foster, I said gently. I'm a journalist. I've been looking for you for 6 months. You're safe now. You're going home. Lauren's face crumpled and she started crying, deep sobs that shook her entire frame. The paramedics moved in to provide medical attention, while federal agents began the process of taking statements. I managed to speak briefly with each woman before they were taken away, just long enough to confirm they'd been coerced into building cryptocurrency laundering systems for the Triad, threatened with violence against their families if they refused or tried to escape. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of official statements, paperwork, and repeated questioning. Mitchell kept his word about not arresting me, though he made it clear that my association with the Versiani organization would be documented and could be used if any future cases arose. By the time I was released, dawn was breaking over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Joseph was waiting outside the police station in the black SUV, looking tired but composed. Get in. Christopher wants to talk to you. The drive took us to a private medical clinic in the suburbs, the kind of facility that caters to people who value discretion over insurance claims. Christopher sat in a recovery room, his left arm properly bandaged now, wearing a fresh shirt someone had brought him. He looked up when I entered, and the carefully controlled fury in his expression made me stop just inside the doorway. You called the police. It wasn't a question. I saved your life. I kept my voice steady, despite the tremor running through my hands. You were outnumbered and trapped. People were dying. What else was I supposed to do? Follow the plan. Trust that I had backup protocols in place. Anything except involving law enforcement in an operation that could have gotten all of us arrested or killed. Your backup protocols weren't working fast enough. I heard the radio traffic. You were pinned down with multiple casualties. Another 5 minutes and you might have been dead. He stood, moving toward me with the predatory grace that always made my breath catch. You made a decision that affected not just me, but my entire organization. The Triad is detained but not destroyed, which means there will be retaliation. The police now have documentation connecting me to tonight's events, and you've compromised your own safety by being identified as someone who works with my family. I know all that. I lifted my chin, meeting his gaze directly, and I'd make the same choice again, because those women are alive and free. Because you're alive and standing here angry at me instead of dead in a warehouse. I can live with the consequences of that. Something shifted in his expression, the fury banking to reveal exhaustion and grudging respect. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless. I haven't decided which yet. Probably both." He almost smiled at that, then winced and touched his injured arm. "The women, they're really okay? Traumatized, physically exhausted, but alive. Federal agents are protecting them while they recover and give statements. The Triad leadership is being charged with kidnapping, human trafficking, and about a dozen financial crimes. It's going to be a major case. Probably national news by morning, which means you got your story. I got something better. I got them back alive." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling between us. Finally, Christopher spoke again, his voice quieter. "Mitchell pulled me aside before they released me. Told me he knows you called him tonight, that you took responsibility for involving law enforcement. He said you put yourself at legal risk to save my life and my men's lives, and that I should remember that before I did something stupid, like exact revenge on a civilian journalist." "Did you tell him you don't do revenge on civilians?" "I told him that you and I had business to conclude regarding the women's stories, and that he should focus his attention on the actual criminals who'd committed actual crimes instead of harassing people who'd helped with the rescue." Christopher moved to sit back down, clearly more injured than he wanted to admit. "My family's attorneys are already working to ensure none of tonight's events lead to charges against my organization. It helps that we arrived at the warehouse after the Triad ambushed us, technically making us the victims rather than the aggressors. Self-defense," I said, understanding the legal strategy. "Exactly. Combined with the fact that we provided information that led to the rescue of 6 kidnapping victims, including 3 that law enforcement had given up on. The district attorney is unlikely to press charges. We'll maintain our distance from official investigation, cooperate minimally, and let the Triad take the fall for everything. Over the next week, I lived in a strange suspended reality. Federal agents interviewed me multiple times, building their case against the Triad leadership. Detective Mitchell checked in daily, half protecting me and half ensuring I wasn't going to disappear or change my story. And I spent every spare moment interviewing Lauren, Samantha, and Brittany, documenting their experiences with their permission, building the most important article of my career. Christopher maintained physical distance, but sent messages through Joseph confirming he was recovering, that territorial negotiations with other crime families were happening behind the scenes, that the Triad's presence in Boston was being systematically dismantled. He'd stepped back from visible leadership as part of an agreement with rival organizations, letting Joseph handle day-to-day operations while he played consultant from the shadows. The article I published 3 weeks later landed like a bomb in journalistic circles. "The women the city forgot. How 3 kidnapping victims survived 6 months of high-tech slavery became national news within hours of hitting the magazine's website." I'd omitted Christopher's specific role per our agreement, focusing instead on the victims' stories and the Triad's sophisticated operation. Lauren, Samantha, and Brittany were portrayed as survivors rather than victims, brave women who'd endured unimaginable circumstances and lived to tell about it. Rachel called me the morning after publication, her voice thick with pride and concern. "Megan, this is incredible work. Best thing you've ever written. But I'm getting calls from other news organizations wanting to know how you got access to these women before anyone else, how you knew where to find them. What do I tell them? Tell them I did 6 months of old-fashioned investigative journalism that law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't do. Tell them I followed leads everyone else had given up on. And tell them the women trusted me to tell their story honestly, which is why they talked to me first." All true, even if it wasn't the complete truth. 3 weeks after the rescue, Detective Mitchell called to inform me that the Triad leaders had been formally charged and would face trial within 6 months. With their organization dismantled and leadership in custody, the threat level against me had dropped significantly. My police protection was being withdrawn. That night, I sat in my apartment in Boston for the first time in almost a month, staring at the stack of research I'd accumulated on the case, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that had changed. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on the article. The women deserve to have their story told properly. You did good work. Take care of yourself, Megan. C." I stared at those words for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button. But what could I say? Thank you for helping me find them? Sorry for calling the cops. I'm glad you didn't die. None of it seemed adequate to capture the complicated relationship we'd developed, built on mutual need and grudging respect, and something else I wasn't ready to examine too closely. Instead, I saved the number and put my phone away, knowing that whatever happened next, whatever consequences still waited to unfold, I'd made the right choices when they mattered most. And sometimes, that had to be satisfaction in itself. Returning to my apartment felt surreal, like stepping back into a life that belonged to someone else. The small studio on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in Alston looked exactly as I'd left it over a month ago, but everything felt different now. The stack of research on my desk about the missing women seemed almost quaint compared to what I'd actually experienced. Books about organized crime that I'd used for background felt like children's stories, next to the reality of Christopher Verciani and his world. I spent the first week trying to establish some kind of normalcy, writing follow-up pieces for Rachel about the triad prosecution, fielding interview requests from other publications who wanted to know how I'd cracked the case when law enforcement had failed. I gave careful, diplomatic answers that satisfied curiosity without revealing anything that could compromise Christopher or his organization. It was a delicate balance, and I wasn't entirely sure I was succeeding. The nightmares started on the 4th night. The church, the armed men searching, the tunnels beneath Boston, the warehouse firefight. I'd wake at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, reaching for my phone to check news reports about the case, making sure it had all really happened, and the women were truly safe. On the 8th day back, my phone rang with an unknown local number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Megan Foster? The voice was female, tentative, familiar from the brief interviews I'd conducted at the rescue site. Yes, this is Megan. This is Lauren Scott. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. The federal agents gave me your contact information. I wanted to thank you properly for everything you did to find us. My throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Lauren, how are you doing? Are you getting the support you need? Better than I was. The FBI has been helpful, connecting us with therapists who specialize in trauma. My family came from Oregon to stay with me for a while. She paused. Samantha and I were wondering if you'd be willing to meet us for coffee. There's so much we want to say that we couldn't when we were being interviewed by agents and surrounded by police. We arranged to meet 2 days later at a cafe in Cambridge, neutral territory away from the North End and its complicated associations. I arrived early, ordering tea I didn't drink while watching the door. Lauren entered first, looking healthier than the last time I'd seen her, wearing jeans and a sweater that hung loose on her still thin frame. Samantha followed moments later, her red hair freshly cut, glasses new. The embrace we shared was tight and emotional. 3 women connected by circumstances none of us would have chosen, but had survived together in our own ways. You look good, I said, as we settled into a corner booth. Both of you. I've been worried. We're getting there, Samantha replied, wrapping her hands around a coffee cup like it could provide warmth against memories that still ran cold. Some days are harder than others, but being free, being home, that's everything. Lauren reached across the table to squeeze my hand. The agents told us you'd been investigating our disappearances for 6 months, that you never gave up even when the police closed our cases. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone should have done, but no one else did, Samantha said quietly. Everyone else moved on. Our families were told there was nothing more that could be done, that we'd probably left voluntarily or gotten involved in something illegal ourselves. You were the only one who kept looking. We talked for over an hour about their recovery, their plans for the future, the therapy sessions and legal proceedings ahead. Lauren was considering moving back to Oregon to be closer to family. Samantha wanted to stay in Boston but was looking for a new apartment, somewhere that didn't carry the memory of the night she'd been taken. As our conversation wound down, Lauren mentioned something casually that made my breath catch. That man who helped coordinate the rescue, the Italian one with the dark eyes. He had someone reach out through my attorney to make sure we had everything we needed. Money for therapy, security if we felt unsafe, help with relocation costs if we wanted to move. It was all very discreet, no strings attached. Christopher Verciani, I said. the name feeling strange on my tongue, in this normal cafe surrounded by students and professionals living ordinary lives. Yes. His representative mentioned that you'd been working together to find us. Asked if we'd seen you, if you were doing okay. Lauren studied me with the kind of insight that came from surviving trauma that forced you to read people carefully. He seemed very concerned about your well-being. Something warm and complicated unfurled in my chest. He's complicated. So are you, Samantha said with a small smile. Takes one to know one. After we parted with promises to stay in touch, I walked back to my apartment through streets that should have felt familiar, but somehow didn't anymore. I kept scanning crowds, looking for broad shoulders and dark hair, checking reflections in windows for anyone following. Not because I felt threatened, but because some part of me was searching for someone specific. A week after meeting Lauren and Samantha, I came home late from an interview to find a cream-colored envelope tucked under my door. No postage, no address label, just my first name written in firm, angular handwriting I recognized from the maps we'd studied together in Cape Cod. Inside was a key on a simple ring and a card with an address in Back Bay. On the back, a short message. If you want answers about what happened after, or just to talk, no pressure. See, I turned the key over in my fingers, feeling the weight of it, the implications. Christopher Verciani had given me access to his private space, trusted me with his location, offered conversation without demands. It was a gesture that felt significant beyond the simple metal and cardboard. For 2 days, I debated. The key sat on my kitchen counter, catching light from the window, impossible to ignore. I picked it up dozens of times, put it back down, argued with myself about what going to that address would mean. Finally, I called Ashley Morgan, a journalist I'd worked with on several stories over the years, someone who knew me well enough to call out my nonsense. I need advice, I said when she answered. About the Verciani story? I thought you wrapped that up. Not exactly about the story. About Christopher Verciani specifically. There was a pause. Then Ashley's voice came back more serious. Megan, please tell me you're not getting personally involved with a mafia boss. I don't know what I'm doing. That's why I'm calling. I explained about the key, the message, my hesitation. Ashley was quiet for a moment before responding. In all the years I've known you, I've never seen you hesitate about following up with a source. You once flew to Guatemala on 12 hours' notice to interview a cartel informant. You've never been afraid of dangerous people if they had information you needed. This feels different. Because it is different. This isn't about the story anymore, is it? This is personal. The truth of it hit me squarely. Yes. Then you need to decide what you want, Megan. Not what's professional or safe or smart, but what you actually want. Because whatever you decide, there will be consequences. Just make sure they're consequences you can live with. After hanging up, I stared at the key for another hour. Then I grabbed my jacket and headed out before I could change my mind. The address led me to a building in Back Bay, all brick and glass with a doorman who nodded at me like he'd been expecting my arrival. The elevator took me to the top floor, which apparently consisted of a single penthouse unit. My hands shook slightly as I used the key, hearing the lock click open. The space beyond was nothing like I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the Charles River, the water reflecting city lights in rippling patterns. The interior was modern but warm. Leather and wood and neutral colors, lived in rather than staged. Books filled built-in shelves. Real books with worn spines suggesting they'd been read. Music played softly from hidden speakers. Something classical I didn't recognize. Christopher stood by the windows, wearing jeans and a dark sweater instead of his usual suits, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. His left arm was still wrapped in a discreet bandage, visible where his sleeve was pushed up to his elbow. He turned when he heard me enter, genuine surprise crossing his features. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly. "I hoped, but I didn't expect it. I needed to know if you were really okay, and if Lauren and Samantha and Brittany are truly safe, if the triad situation is actually resolved or if there's still danger." He gestured to a leather sofa, and we both sat, maintaining careful distance. "I'm healing. The gunshot was clean, no permanent damage. As for the women, yes, they're safe. The triad leadership is in federal custody facing charges that will keep them locked up for decades. Their organization in Boston has been completely dismantled. Remaining members fled back to New York and California, rather than risk staying in territory they no longer control. Lauren mentioned you've been helping them. Money for therapy, security, relocation assistance. It seemed appropriate. They suffered because of territorial disputes in my world. The least I could do was ensure their recovery wasn't hampered by financial concerns. He paused, studying me. She also told me you met with them, that you're staying in touch, making sure they have support. Of course I am. I didn't spend 6 months looking for them just to abandon them once they were found. Something in his expression softened. That's what makes you different, Megan. Most people would consider the rescue the end of the story. You understand, it's just the beginning. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The city spread out below us, distant and beautiful. Christopher looked different here. In his private space, away from the constant vigilance his position required. Lighter, like Lauren had said about him. More human and less dangerous, though I knew that was probably an illusion. What happened after the warehouse? I asked. You said things changed. What does that mean exactly? He leaned back, choosing his words carefully. After the triad arrests and the media coverage of the rescue, every crime family in the Northeast knew the Versiani organization had been involved in something that went very public. That kind of exposure is dangerous in my world. It invites scrutiny, makes people nervous. He gestured toward the river. So we negotiated, a series of meetings with rival organizations, discussing territory, operations, spheres of influence. The result was an agreement that recognized the North End and Port District as exclusively ours, with no further challenges or encroachments. Everyone got something they wanted, and the violence stopped. What was the price? I stepped back from visible leadership for 6 months. Joseph handles day-to-day operations while I consult from behind the scenes. It gives everyone time to adjust to the new territorial boundaries, lets tensions cool, removes me as a focal point for anyone who might want to test the agreement. He looked at me directly. It also gives me time to figure out what I want my role to be moving forward. Whether this life, this world, is something I want to continue, or if there are other paths worth considering. The implications of that statement hung heavy between us. That's a big decision. It is. And it's one I'm still working through. He stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Can I offer you something? I promise it's not drugged or designed to compromise your journalistic integrity. I smiled despite myself. Wine would be good. He poured with practiced ease, handing me a glass before retaking his seat, this time slightly closer. Tell me about your life now. The article was powerful, by the way. You told their story with dignity and respect. Lauren was right to trust you with it. We talked for hours, the conversation flowing more easily than it ever had before. Without the pressure of rescue operations or immediate danger, we could actually get to know each other as people, rather than reluctant allies. He told me about growing up in North End, about the family expectations and the weight of tradition, about the cousin who died and how it had shaped his approach to leadership. I shared stories about covering conflicts overseas, about the strange disconnection between witnessing horror and then returning to normal life, about losing both parents young and using work to fill the emptiness. Somewhere around midnight, the conversation shifted to something more immediate, more honest. Why did you really come tonight? Christopher asked, setting down his wine glass. Because I've been looking for you, I admitted. Walking through Boston, scanning crowds, checking over my shoulder, not because I was afraid, but because I was searching for someone specific. And I realized that meant something. What does it mean? That whatever happened between us during the rescue operation, it wasn't just professional necessity or temporary alliance. There's something here, something complicated and probably inadvisable, but real. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and took my hand. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. I've been thinking about you constantly since that night at the warehouse, wondering if you were safe, if you regretted calling the police, if you'd ever want to see me again after everything you'd witnessed. I don't regret it. Any of it. Even knowing what I am, what I've done. I squeezed his hand. I know exactly who you are, Christopher. The good parts and the complicated parts. And I'm still here. We stayed like that for a long moment, holding hands like teenagers on a first date despite everything we'd been through together. Finally, he pulled back slightly, his expression serious. If we do this, if we explore whatever this connection is, it can't be casual. My world doesn't allow for casual relationships. Anyone close to me becomes a target, a potential leverage point. I need you to understand that before we go any further. I understand. I also understand that I've spent 6 months chasing a story that put me in more danger than I ever anticipated. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat because some things matter more than safety. His slow smile transformed his entire face. You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most reckless. Can't it be both? He laughed, the sound genuine and warm. Yes, it definitely can. When I left his penthouse 3 hours later, the key safely in my pocket, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Whatever happened next, whatever complications arose from getting personally involved with Christopher Versiani, I'd made the choice with open eyes and full awareness of the consequences. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I felt like I was moving forward rather than just reacting to circumstances beyond my control. Over the next 2 months, Christopher and I developed a relationship that defied every logical category. We weren't quite dating in any traditional sense, but we weren't just friends or professional acquaintances either. We existed in some undefined space between all those labels, meeting for dinners at quiet restaurants, taking long walks along the harbor where he'd grown up, spending evenings in conversation that stretched past midnight. He respected my boundaries in ways that surprised me. I kept my apartment, continued working on investigative pieces for Rachel and other publications. He never asked me to move in, or questioned my work schedule, or tried to control any aspect of my life. It was refreshing after years of covering stories about men who confused love with ownership, and after my brief experience with an ex-boyfriend in college, who'd thought my career should always come second to his convenience. But Christopher was different. When I landed a major interview that required me to fly to Washington for 3 days, he simply said, "Be safe," and had Joseph arrange discreet security that stayed far enough back I almost didn't notice them. When I published a piece critical of how organized crime was portrayed in popular media, he read it carefully and pointed out where I'd gotten details wrong about family structures, educating me without being defensive. We learned each other slowly, carefully. I discovered he had a degree in business from Boston College that he'd earned while simultaneously learning his family's actual business. That he spoke 4 languages fluently and read philosophy for relaxation. That he'd never wanted this life, but had inherited it when his father died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving a 26-year-old Christopher to either step up or watch everything his family had built collapse into chaos. He learned that I'd originally wanted to be a novelist, but had turned to journalism after my parents died, because I needed to focus on concrete truths rather than fiction. That I had nightmares about Syria sometimes, waking at 3 a.m. with the sound of bombs still echoing in my ears. That I touched my mother's compass necklace whenever I was nervous, because it reminded me that someone had once believed I was brave, even when I didn't believe it myself. December arrived with the first real cold, the kind of bitter wind off the Atlantic that made Boston feel like the edge of the world. I was working on a new investigation, something completely separate from the Triad case, looking into allegations of corruption in the police department. Specifically, officers who'd been taking bribes to ignore certain criminal activities in exchange for cash and protection. It was dangerous work, the kind that made sources nervous and officials hostile. But I'd found a former officer willing to talk, a man whose conscience had finally outweighed his fear. His testimony could blow open a corruption ring that had operated for over a decade. 3 days after I submitted my article to Rachel for final edits, I received the first threat. An anonymous email with no return address. Just a simple message. Drop the corruption story or you'll regret it. I forwarded it to Detective Mitchell, who I'd stayed in contact with since the Triad case. He called me within an hour, his voice grim. "Megan, we need to talk. That corruption story you're working on, it involves Officer Daniel Reeves. He's got connections to what's left of the Triad operation in New York. This isn't just dirty cops. This is organized crime retaliation. I'm not dropping the story, Mitchell. I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you to be careful. These people don't make empty threats. I took precautions, varied my routes, checked my car for tampering, kept my apartment locked and alarm set. But I also refused to live in fear or ask Christopher for help. We'd built something based on mutual respect and independence, and running to him every time I faced danger would undermine that foundation. Looking back, pride was probably my worst enemy. The attack came on a Thursday evening in the parking garage of my building. I'd been at the magazine offices late, working with Rachel on final fact-checking. It was nearly 9 when I pulled into my assigned spot on the second level, the fluorescent lights casting everything in sickly yellow. I noticed the van immediately. Wrong spot. Windows tinted too dark. Engine running despite no driver visible inside. Every instinct I'd honed covering war zones screamed danger, and I was reaching for my phone when 2 men emerged from behind a concrete pillar. They moved fast, professionally trained, one circling to cut off my retreat while the other advanced directly. I didn't hesitate. I threw my bag at the nearest one and ran for the stairwell, keys clutched between my fingers as a makeshift weapon. I almost made it. My hand was on the door handle when something hard struck the back of my head, sending me sprawling. Pain exploded across my skull, vision blurring, as rough hands grabbed my arms and hauled me upright. "The corruption story," one of them said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You're going to call your editor right now and tell her you're killing it. Say you got the facts wrong. Say your source recanted. Say whatever you want. But that story doesn't publish." "Go to hell," I managed, tasting copper blood from where I'd bitten my tongue. The second man pulled out a knife, the blade catching the garage lights. "We can do this easy or hard. Your choice." That's when I heard the footsteps. Multiple sets, moving with the same professional silence as my attackers, but coming from the opposite direction. The 2 men froze, exchanging glances, and suddenly Christopher was there with Joseph flanking him. Christopher's expression was absolutely cold, devoid of any warmth or mercy I'd seen in our private moments. This was the crime boss, the man who'd survived decades in a world built on violence. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying that dangerous softness that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "You're in my territory threatening someone under my protection. That's a fatal mistake." "Verciani," one of my attackers said, recognition and fear mixing in his tone. "We didn't know she was yours. We were just delivering a message from Reeves, and now I'm delivering one back. Tell Reeves that if he or anyone associated with him comes near Megan Foster again, I'll consider it a declaration of war. Tell him I don't lose wars." The 2 men ran, actually ran, leaving me standing there with blood dripping down my neck, and my legs shaking so badly I could barely stay upright. Christopher moved to support me immediately, his touch gentle despite the violence he'd just promised. "Are you hurt?" His voice had transformed completely, concern replacing the coldness. "Just my head. I'll be fine. You're bleeding. Joseph, get the car. We're taking her to the clinic." "I don't need a clinic. I need to call Mitchell and report this attack and finish my article because I'm not letting corrupt cops and triad remnants intimidate me into silence." Christopher actually smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's exactly what I expected you to say. But you're going to the clinic first, getting checked for concussion, and then we're going to have a conversation about your definition of acceptable risk." The private clinic was the same one he'd used after the warehouse, discreet and efficient. The doctor confirmed a mild concussion, cleaned the cut on my scalp, and prescribed rest and observation for 24 hours. Christopher drove me back to my apartment in silence, his jaw tight with emotions he wasn't expressing. Inside my small studio, he methodically checked every window and lock while I sat on my couch pressing an ice pack to my head. Finally, he sat beside me, his hands showing split knuckles I hadn't noticed before. He'd hit someone, probably one of my attackers, hard enough to break skin. "You knew they were coming," I said, understanding dawning. "You had people watching me." "Of course I did." "You're investigating corruption connected to the triad. You think I wouldn't keep eyes on you after everything that happened? Without telling me? Without asking permission? Would you have accepted protection if I'd asked?" I wanted to be angry about the invasion of privacy, but honesty won out. "No. I would have said I could handle it myself, and tonight proved how well that worked." His voice was sharp, frustration breaking through his usual control. "You were 10 seconds away from having your throat cut in a parking garage, Megan. 10 seconds. If we'd been any later. But you weren't. You were there." I set down the ice pack and turned to face him fully. "Christopher, I appreciate that you're trying to protect me, but I can't live my life with bodyguards and surveillance just because I'm involved with you. That's not who I am." "Then who are you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, you're someone who takes insane risks without backup, who walks into danger like it's nothing, who refuses help even when her life depends on it. I'm someone who does the work that matters regardless of the cost. The same as you." That stopped him. He stared at me for a long moment, then laughed without humor. "You're right. We're the same. Both too stubborn to step back. Both willing to risk everything for what we believe in, which is exactly why this terrifies me." I'd never heard him admit fear before. "What terrifies you?" "Losing you to something I could have prevented. Watching you die because I respected your independence too much to interfere." He took my hand carefully, mindful of the ice pack I'd been holding. "I can't make you accept protection. I can't control your decisions or your work. But I'm asking you, as someone who cares about you more than is probably wise, to let me help keep you safe. Not because you're weak or incapable, but because everyone needs backup sometimes." The raw honesty in his voice broke through my defenses. "What does that look like?" "Realistically, basic security measures. You tell me when you're working on dangerous stories. I provide discreet surveillance that doesn't interfere with your work. You accept a panic button that connects directly to my people. And in exchange, I promise never to use those resources to monitor you personally or interfere with your independence unless your life is in immediate danger." It was a reasonable compromise, more reasonable than I'd expected. And if I trigger the panic button unnecessarily, then I get there fast and apologize for the interruption. He squeezed my hand gently. "Megan, I'm not trying to cage you. I'm trying to keep you alive so we can continue having these arguments for years to come." I studied his face, seeing the genuine fear beneath the careful control. This was what vulnerability looked like for Christopher Versiani. Not tears or dramatic declarations, but quiet admission that he couldn't bear to lose me. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll accept basic security. But Christopher, you have to trust that I know how to do my job. I've survived war zones and hostile governments and criminal organizations. I'm not reckless. I'm careful. There's a difference. I know there is. And I'm sorry for implying otherwise." He pulled me closer, careful of my injured head, and I let myself lean against him. "For what it's worth, I'd never want you to be anyone other than exactly who you are. Even when who you are gives me heart attacks on a regular basis." I smiled, despite the throbbing pain in my skull. "Same goes for you." I knew what I was getting into when I agreed to explore this relationship. I'm not going to suddenly demand you become someone safe and predictable. "Good, because I'm not sure I know how to be either of those things." We sat like that for a long time, holding each other in my small apartment while the city hummed beyond my windows. Somewhere out there, corrupt cops and triad remnants were regrouping, planning their next moves. My corruption story would publish despite their threats, and there would be consequences for that courage. But for now, in this moment, I felt safer than I had in months. Not because Christopher could protect me from everything, but because we'd finally established the terms of our relationship. Partners, equals, two people choosing each other while maintaining their own identities and principles. It wasn't traditional or simple or without risks, but it was real, built on mutual respect and honest acknowledgement of who we both were, and that was worth fighting for. 3 months into the following spring, I'd managed to establish something I never thought possible. A life that felt balanced. Not perfect, not simple, but functional in ways that mattered. My studio apartment in Alston remained my official address, the place where I kept the majority of my books and research materials, where I'd retreat when work required total focus. Christopher's penthouse in Back Bay had become the place I gravitated toward when I wanted company, conversation, the quiet comfort of someone who understood my work without needing constant explanation. We never formalized the arrangement. Some nights I'd show up at his door with takeout and stay until morning. Other times I'd disappear into my own space for 3 or 4 days straight. emerging only when a story was finished, and my brain needed human interaction again. He never questioned the pattern, never demanded explanations for my absences. It was the kind of trust that takes most couples years to build, but we'd compressed those years into months of life-or-death situations that forced honesty faster than comfort ever could. The work continued to consume most of my waking hours. Rachel had promoted me to senior investigative correspondent, which came with better pay and more autonomy, but also higher expectations. I spent weeks tracking corruption in housing development schemes, months investigating labor exploitation in restaurant kitchens across the city. Each story required the same meticulous approach that had helped me find Lauren, Samantha, and Brittany, building cases from fragments of evidence that others had overlooked or chosen to ignore. Christopher's world evolved too, though his changes were less visible to anyone outside his immediate circle. He'd officially stepped back from day-to-day leadership of the Versiani organization, letting Joseph handle operations while he focused on what he called strategic development. In practice, that meant converting more of the family's holdings into legitimate businesses, investing in neighborhood improvement projects, and carefully distancing himself from anything that could draw federal attention. I watched him navigate this transition with the same calculated precision he applied to everything. Sunday dinners at Aunt Lucia's house revealed the family's mixed reactions. Some of the older generation respected the move toward legitimacy. Others worried that going soft would invite challenges from rival organizations. Christopher handled all of it with patience, explaining his vision, making compromises where he could, holding firm on points that mattered. "You're changing the family from the inside," I observed one evening after a particularly tense dinner, where two of his uncles had questioned his decisions about territorial agreements. "Trying to," he corrected, pouring wine for both of us. "Change is slow. These traditions go back 3 generations. You don't just decide one day to become legitimate and expect everyone to follow without resistance. But you're making progress. Some days it feels like progress. Other days it feels like I'm betraying everything my father built." He set down the bottle and looked at me directly. "Do you think it's possible to come from this world and actually leave it behind?" "I think you're doing something harder than leaving," I said. "You're staying and trying to transform it into something better. That takes more courage than walking away." His expression softened in the way it did when I'd said something he needed to hear, but hadn't allowed himself to believe. "Thank you for that." The challenge to our carefully constructed equilibrium came not from his world or mine, but from the intersection where they collided. 2 months after my corruption expose on police involvement with Triad remnants, the U.S. Attorney's Office formally requested my cooperation in their ongoing investigation into organized crime financial networks. They wanted me to testify about Christopher's role in the Triad case, specifically whether he'd profited from the organization's dismantling. My media lawyer, Diane, reviewed the subpoena with the kind of cold efficiency I'd come to appreciate. They're fishing, looking for anything that might give them leverage for a larger case. You're protected under SHIELD laws for anything obtained as a journalist, but they're arguing that your relationship with Versiani goes beyond professional source protection. How do they even know about the relationship? I asked, though I suspected the answer. Surveillance, probably. Maybe informants within his organization. Once the government decides someone is a target, they gather information from every possible angle. She looked at me seriously. "The question is how you want to handle this. We can fight the subpoena entirely, which will be expensive and time-consuming but winnable. Or you can appear for a limited deposition with strict parameters about what you'll discuss. What do you recommend?" "Fight it." Appearing at all sets a precedent that journalists can be compelled to testify about sources, even with restrictions. It's bad for the profession, and bad for your future ability to develop sources in sensitive stories. I told Christopher about the subpoena that evening, watching his face carefully for reaction. He was cooking, something he did when he needed to think. His hands moving through the familiar motions of chopping vegetables with precise efficiency. "They're trying to use you as a weapon against me," he said finally, his voice remarkably calm. "It's a smart strategy. I can fight prosecutors directly, but going after the people I care about creates pressure from a different angle. Diane thinks we can fight the subpoena successfully. SHIELD laws are strong in Massachusetts." "And if you lose? If a judge decides your relationship with me compromises your protections, then I'll have to decide what I'm willing to say and what I'm not." I moved closer, leaning against the counter where I could see his face. Christopher, I need you to know that I won't lie under oath. If they ask me direct questions about things I've witnessed, I'll tell the truth. But I also won't volunteer information or help them build a case against you. He set down the knife and turned to face me fully. I would never ask you to perjure yourself, Megan. Your integrity is one of the things I love most about you. If answering their questions honestly means I face legal consequences, that's my problem to deal with, not yours. The casual way he said love made my breath catch, even though we'd been circling that word for months now. You're being very calm about potentially going to prison. I've been preparing for that possibility since I took over the family business. My lawyers are excellent. I've been careful about documentation and insulation. And honestly, the fact that I've been moving toward legitimacy for months gives me a defense that someone still actively committing crimes wouldn't have. He reached out to take my hand. What I'm not calm about is the idea of you being forced to choose between your principles and protecting me. That's an impossible position, and I'm sorry you're in it because of me. Over the next month, Diane filed motions to quash the subpoena, arguing that compelling a journalist to testify about confidential sources would create a chilling effect on press freedom. The U.S. Attorney's Office pushed back, claiming my personal relationship with Christopher meant I wasn't acting purely as a journalist. It became a legal chess match, each side maneuvering for advantage. During all of this, I continued working. A major story about wage theft in construction projects connected to city contracts consumed my attention, providing welcome distraction from the looming legal battle. The investigation required interviewing dozens of workers, most of them immigrants afraid to speak publicly, and I spent weeks building trust before anyone would go on record. One evening, I was reviewing transcripts at Christopher's penthouse when Joseph arrived unexpectedly. He had the kind of controlled tension that meant something serious had happened. "We have a problem," he said, without preamble. "One of our people has been approached by federal agents. They're offering immunity in exchange for testimony about financial operations, specifically anything that might connect Christopher to money laundering or racketeering." Christopher's expression didn't change, but I saw his fingers tighten slightly on the glass he was holding. "Who?" "Vincent. He's been with us for 8 years, solid until now. But his daughter has health problems, medical bills piling up. The feds are offering to cover everything if he cooperates." "That's a strong incentive," Christopher said quietly. "What's he asking for?" "He came to me first. Wanted to know if there was any way we could help with the medical costs. I think he's looking for a reason not to cooperate, but he needs money immediately." I watched Christopher process this, seeing the calculation behind his eyes. He could match the federal offer, buy Vincent's continued loyalty, but that would look like witness tampering if it ever came to light. Or he could let Vincent cooperate, accept that prosecution might be inevitable. "Cover the medical bills," Christopher said finally. "All of them. Set up a trust that continues covering any future treatments his daughter needs. Do it through legitimate channels, make it look like employee assistance rather than hush money, and tell Vincent that his choice to talk or not talk to federal agents is his own. No pressure either way." Joseph looked surprised. "You're taking a risk. If he testifies, he could provide the evidence they need. Maybe. But I'm not going to let a child suffer because her father worked for me. We help our people, Joseph. That's always been the principle." After Joseph left, I set aside my work and moved to sit beside Christopher on the couch. That was either very noble or very naive. Probably both. He leaned back, exhaustion clear in the lines around his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what kind of legacy I want to leave. My father ran this organization with an iron fist, ruled through fear and obligation. People stayed loyal because they were afraid of what happened if they didn't. I want something different. I want people to stay because they believe in what we're building, because we actually take care of them. Even if that means some of them betray you? Even then. Because if I compromise my principles to avoid prosecution, what's the point of having principles at all?" The legal situation continued to evolve over the following weeks. My shield law protections held up under judicial review, and the subpoena was quashed after Diane successfully argued that my work on the Triad case was protected journalistic activity. The victory felt hollow, though, because the U.S. Attorney's Office simply shifted tactics, focusing their investigation on Christopher's financial activities through other avenues. Vincent ultimately declined to cooperate with federal agents, stating publicly through his lawyer that he had no knowledge of any illegal activities and that his employer had been nothing but supportive during his family's medical crisis. Whether that was truth or loyalty or some combination of both, I never asked. What I did notice was how the people in Christopher's orbit seemed to be watching him differently now. There was a respect that went beyond fear, a sense that maybe the organization was transforming into something that served its members, rather than just extracting loyalty from them. Lauren contacted me in early summer with news that made all the legal stress feel suddenly less important. She'd gotten engaged to someone she'd met through the support group for trafficking survivors, a man who understood trauma without needing extensive explanation. She wanted me to be at the wedding and asked if I'd be willing to give a reading during the ceremony. "You were the first person who believed we were worth saving," she said when we met for coffee to discuss details. "I want you there to celebrate that we're not just surviving anymore. We're actually building lives again." I attended the wedding on a perfect June afternoon in a small chapel outside Portland, Oregon. Samantha was there too, along with Brittany, who'd traveled from Chicago, where she'd relocated to be closer to family. We spent the reception catching up, sharing stories of recovery and resilience that didn't feel heavy because we were choosing to remember rather than being forced to relive. When I returned to Boston, I told Christopher about the wedding, about seeing the three women laughing and dancing and simply being alive in a world that had tried to destroy them. "You gave them that," he said quietly. "You refused to let them be forgotten." "We gave them that," I corrected. "I couldn't have found them without your resources and information." "Maybe. But I've been involved in a lot of operations over the years, Megan. Very few of them ended with weddings and hope." "That's all you." We were standing on his balcony, the Charles River below reflecting city lights in shimmering patterns. Summer heat had finally arrived, making the night air thick and warm, carrying sounds of traffic and distant music from bars along the waterfront. "I've been thinking about what comes next," I said, not entirely sure where the words were going until they were already out. For us, I mean. This pattern we've been in. The separate apartments, the undefined status. It works. But it also feels temporary, like we're still deciding whether to commit. "And have you decided?" His voice was careful, neutral, giving me space to define things without pressure. "I think I decided months ago. I just wasn't ready to admit it." I turned to face him. "I want this to be permanent, Christopher. Not the logistics necessarily, but the commitment. I want to stop hedging and pretending this is casual when we both know it stopped being casual the moment we walked out of those tunnels together." He studied me for a long moment, his expression serious. "You understand what permanent means in my world? The government will always see you as potential leverage against me. Rival organizations, if any emerge, will view you as a target. Your career will constantly be scrutinized for conflicts of interest. Nothing gets easier." "I know, and I'm choosing it anyway." I moved closer, taking his hands. "We've been through enough that I'm not naive about the complications, but I'm also not willing to walk away from something real just because it's difficult." His slow smile was worth every ounce of vulnerability the admission had cost me. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I'm completely in love with you, Megan Foster. Have been for months, and I'm tired of pretending there's any version of my future that doesn't include you in it." We stood there on the balcony as the city continued its endless motion below us, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and somehow built something worth keeping. When we finally went back inside, it felt different, not because anything had fundamentally changed, but because we'd finally acknowledged what had been true for a long time. The next morning, Christopher had to leave early for meetings. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to sounds of the city waking up, thinking about how far I'd come from the woman who'd walked into Santa Maria della Vittoria 6 months ago with nothing but questions and determination. That woman had found answers, though not the ones she'd been looking for. She'd found Lauren and Samantha and Brittany, yes, but she'd also found parts of herself she hadn't known existed, capabilities and compromises and courage she'd never had to access before. And she'd found Christopher, complicated, dangerous, surprisingly principled Christopher, who'd challenged every assumption she'd held about good people and bad people and all the shades of gray in between. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. New lead on the housing corruption story. Source wants to meet. You available? I smiled and typed back. Always. Send me the details. Because that was the truth of it. I was building a life with Christopher, but I was also still completely myself. The journalist who chased stories that mattered. The woman who touched her mother's compass when she was nervous. The person who believed some things were worth risking everything for. The work would continue. The complications would multiply. The government would keep investigating. Rivals would keep circling. And I'd keep writing stories that made powerful people uncomfortable. Christopher would keep trying to transform his family's legacy. Keep walking the line between his father's world and something better. Keep being exactly the kind of man who drove me crazy and made me grateful in equal measure. We'd chosen each other, knowing all of that. Not out of desperation or necessity, but because sometimes the most unlikely connections end up being the most essential ones. And that choice, complicated and difficult, and absolutely real, was something worth fighting for.